today's webinar. My name is Jonathan. I'll be hosting the webinar today. I'm sitting here with Simon Hurst. He's giving a little wave. He is our resident Excel guru, master, aficionado, cowboy, sometimes. Today he's going to be covering what he thinks is the most dangerous function within Excel, VLOOKUP. Now, I'm not too familiar with Excel, but I trust his guidance, and I'm looking forward to find out what makes VLOOKUP so dangerous. We're also here with Max, who is going to be today's sound engineer. So if you do have any questions about the about Simon's presentation, just ask them through the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll do our best to answer them immediately if we can, or write them down, and then Simon will answer a number of them at the end of the webinar. The webinar is due to last about 35 to 40 minutes in total. If it runs a little short, Simon will endeavor to answer some more questions. And if you do have any network problems or any audio problems, then just throw that through as a question as well, and we'll do our best to answer that. So without any further ado, I'm gonna pass over to Simon, and have a lovely webinar, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Welcome, everybody. I think the webinar is absolutely full. I think I saw something saying that we'd reached the 5:01 maximum, so I would apologise to those people who didn't make it in time, but they won't be able to hear me, so I won't. Welcome, everybody, to VLOOKUP, Excel's most dangerous function, and how to avoid it. We'll be looking, not surprisingly I suppose, at VLOOKUP. We'll also look at the horizontal expression of VLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, and we'll look at some other functions that can help you do more than VLOOKUP can, before at the end looking at how you can avoid using lookup functions altogether, but only if you've got certain editions of Excel. Talking about editions and versions of Excel, we will be using 2016 here this afternoon, or whatever time it is where you are. It really, I think, apart from the very last bit where we look at some of the new database functionality that's part of Power Query and Get and Transform, the version really doesn't make any difference. So for all the stuff on functions, really doesn't matter which version you're using. We can see that this is 2016 because you'll see that the ribbon up here is in proper case, upper and lowercase. In 2013 it was all in uppercase. So this is 2016. So I'm going to start off with looking just very simply at how VLOOKUP works, but also highlighting one of the dangers of VLOOKUP. In my experience of working with Excel and people using Excel, I think VLOOKUP is one of the functions that is most likely to give people the wrong answer if they don't fully understand how to use it, and hopefully this will demonstrate why that is. So what we've got down here is a little table with 5 countries in it. Each of those countries has a national flag, and we pick the flag using the ID. So there's a formula that looks at the ID and picks the right flag for that ID. So we want to be able to choose a country name to have that work out what the ID is in the adjacent column, and then it does the rest for us. So this example here, this is based on perhaps a major sporting event that might be hosted somewhere, where maybe when the football's on, they have the flags of the competing teams, and they've got a database of all the countries that are taking part together with their flags, and they need to choose the right flag. So we can see here that if we choose Finland, the formula we're using looks up Finland, finds flag ID 1, and brings in the Finnish flag. And if we look at the formula, here is the formula using VLOOKUP. So VLOOKUP looks at the contents of cell A4, which is the word Finland. It then compares that content, or that value, to the first column, the leftmost column of a range. In our case, the range is A7 to B11, which we've made absolute by using the $sign, so A7 to B11. So our VLOOKUP function will grab Finland and then compare Finland to all the entries in the first column until it finds a match. And then the third argument here of VLOOKUP is which of the columns in our table of data, in this case there are only two, which of the columns in our table of data do we want to return the answer from? Well, we've already typed in the name, so what we want is the ID, which is in column 2, so we enter the number 2. And if you use functions, you'll know that in the more recent versions of Excel, when you're entering a function, as you enter it, a tip appears showing you what each of the arguments does. So the first argument is the lookup value, the second argument is the table array, the block of cells, and the third argument is our column index number. So when we choose Finland, it finds Finland, returns number 1, and that 1 then looks up the flag for us. We've used data validation to give us a drop-down list. So let's just go through the flags and prove they all work. So next we'll go to North Korea. So North Korea finds North Korea, ID 2 brings in the North Korea flag. Switzerland matches Switzerland, finds ID 3 brings in the Swiss flag. USA finds ID 4 brings in the US flag, and unsurprisingly Korea. Now this is the danger of VLOOKUP. We can see here we've chosen South Korea and it's ignored South Korea, and instead it's chosen North Korea and brought in the North Korean flag, although our search term is Korea South. And the reason for that is the missing fourth argument from VLOOKUP. If you just enter the first three arguments as we've done there, then VLOOKUP does what's called an approximate lookup. And that approximate lookup is something very specific. I think a lot of people just think it's find the nearest thing. So if there's an exact match, you'd think it would always find it. But that very much isn't what the approximate form of VLOOKUP does. So one way to sort the problem out is to specifically enter the fourth argument. So if we go to the end and enter the comma, you'll see that the fourth argument is whether it's an approximate match, which is the default, or whether we want an exact match. Now in this case, what we want very much is an exact match. So if we were to choose false for exact match, we should find out that sorts out the problem. Korea South matches Korea South. It uses ID 5. It brings in the correct flag. There's another way we can address the issue. If we use the approximate match either by not having the fourth argument or by setting the fourth argument to true, then for it to work, our list of countries must be in sorted order. It must be sorted in ascending order. So if we were to sort our countries in ascending order, then we'd find that even with an approximate lookup, our VLOOKUP function would still work. So the real danger with VLOOKUP is not understanding that fourth argument and omitting that fourth argument when you're working with a left-hand column that isn't sorted. Because if that's the case, as we saw with our original example, if I just undo the sort again, then you can get completely the wrong answer returned by VLOOKUP. So that fourth argument is the real danger of VLOOKUP. There is another danger of VLOOKUP, some much more straightforward danger, and that's to do with the fact that when you have a VLOOKUP function, it's just looking for a column index number. So if you choose a block of cells, it's always going to be looking for column 2. That means if you were to do something like insert a column in the middle of your block of data, column 2 is now an empty column, and therefore you get the result you're perhaps not expecting. We'll see in a minute or two when we look in detail at the use of the other functions, match and index, that they can avoid that problem by, instead of using just an index number, just the second column, they can actually look for a word and match the word against the list of columns. So even if you do insert a column as we did there, it would still find the right column to create the match. So there, the couple of the dangers of VLOOKUP. Let's now explain, when I was talking about the difference between the exact and approximate match, I mentioned that it's not just a closest match, it's a very specific match. And what the approximate form of VLOOKUP does is to find the item in the table, the largest item in the table, that is equal to or smaller than the value you're looking for. So if we just go through our example here, if we take 0, look in our table, the largest item in our table that is equal to or smaller than 0 is 0, because it's equal to 0. If we go to number 1, the largest item in our table that is equal to or smaller than 1 is still 0. And that's the case all the way up to 99. The largest item in our table that is equal to or smaller than 99 is still 0. It's only when we get to 100 that the largest item in our table that's equal to or smaller than our value changes and obviously becomes 100, and that works to 199. So everything between 100 and 199 becomes cost of sales. Everything from 200 to 299 becomes distribution. 300 to 399 administration. So that can be quite a useful way of using VLOOKUP. And if we look at VLOOKUP, you'll see here that we've specifically added the fourth argument, true. We could have omitted it altogether, and that would have done the same thing. We'll see the difference if I were to change this to make it an exact match. So I'll use false. You'll see that when we do that, only those where there is an exact match found are matched, the others return a not available error. Incidentally, we're using Excel tables. Tables were introduced in 2007. We're using Excel tables, and one of the things that happens in a table is that if you change a formula or create a new formula, it will apply to all the other rows without you having to copy it down generally. So we can see how it works. We could then use that. Maybe we could use that with SUMIF. So we could say, or in fact I'll use SUMIFs, the more modern form of SUMIF. SUMIF allows you one condition, SUMIFs allows you multiple conditions, and what both of the functions do is to enable you to sum a block of cells depending on whether something or other meets a criteria. So we can say that we want to sum the amount cells. So let's just go down to the end. We'll use the column description. So we're doing our table is called trial balance. We're summing the amount column, and we want to compare our criteria range. So we'll start typing in trial balance. We can see that appears here. We can select our table, press a square bracket, and then select our category column. Close our square bracket. So we're comparing our category column with our criteria, and our criteria is the word sales, as in G6. That will create our formula, and again, being a table, that will automatically be copied down to the other rows, and that should give us our total. And we've built here a check of our individual amounts and compared that with a check of our total to make sure that our formulas worked, and that's brought in all the values that we need. So I think some people see the approximate match form of VLOOKUP as just dangerous and something you should never use. It can be extremely useful, but you do have to know how it works, and in particular, for it to work, you must have your first column sorted in ascending order. You can see by the logic of how it works, that column must be sorted in ascending order for it to work properly. There's another the exact form of VLOOKUP and the approximate form of VLOOKUP. This is quite a strange. What I've got here is a weird sheet with a million. You can go down and we see we've got over 1 million rows in use. We have an ID and a value. So this is just a table, might be invoice amounts and values. The values I've just calculated as the invoice amount divided by 100. And what we want to do is to use a lookup to find the invoice amount for a particular ID. And I've tried to design this to make it slow. So it's got to look at 1 million rows or just over 1 million rows. And I've also copied that formula down to 1,000 other rows. So we've got 1,000 calculations, each of which looks at over 1 million rows. So if I were to change something that calls that to recalculate, so if I go here and change one of the values, now we can see that recalculating, and you can see it down here recalculating. It's taking a few seconds. I reckon probably somewhere in the region of 15 seconds. Nearly there, 88, 94, and it's done it. I think that was about 15 seconds. Now let's go and look at our next sheet where we're doing exactly the same thing, but sorry, I should have shown you this. On our first sheet, I should have shown you that we're using the exact match, and on our other sheet, we're using an approximate match. We'll now do exactly the same thing. We'll just change this value, but note that we've sorted our IDs here in ascending order. As we've said, they must be sorted for this to work. So we'll change our top value again, and we'll see if it takes any less than 15 seconds. And you can see that when you use an approximate match, it's pretty much instant. Now that doesn't mean that you can always substitute an approximate match with a sorted list for an exact match. The difference will be that the exact match will return NA, an NA not available error, if the item doesn't exist, whereas an approximate match will just find the largest item smaller than the value. So they do behave differently in certain circumstances, but if that doesn't matter, then sorting your column and doing an approximate lookup is vastly quicker than doing an exact lookup. Let's move on to the horizontal expression of the vertical desire, as somebody might once have called it. This is HLOOKUP. So where VLOOKUP, the V is for vertical, HLOOKUP, the H is for horizontal, and it works in pretty much the same way. But instead of looking at the first column of a block of data, it looks at the first row of a block of data and then finds the value in the same column from a different row rather than in the same row from a different column. So here we've got some invoice dates, and for those of you who aren't in the UK or Europe, value-added tax is a sort of sales tax, so this is like a sales tax. These are the dates when different rates of that tax became applicable. So any invoice dated on that day or afterwards would have that VAT rate applied to it. So, for example, this item here, the 1st of January 2012, comes after the 4th of January 2011, so it would have the 20% rate applied to it. The 31st of December 2008 comes after the 1st of December 2008, so that gets 15% applied to it. The logic is exactly the same as for VLOOKUP. We look up value in a block of data, and this time we look in the top row rather than the leftmost column, and we return a value from a specified row, in this case row 2, and once again we can have true for approximate matches and false for exact matches. And in this case we very much need an approximate match because our table doesn't include every conceivable date. So to find the right date for an invoice, you need to find the largest item in the table that's smaller than or equal to the invoice date you're searching for to give you the correct VAT rate. So that's HLOOKUP, just VLOOKUP, but horizontally rather than vertically. Now let's move on to alternatives to using VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP. We're going to look at a matching pair of functions, match and index. And let's just explain index first. So here we've got a block of values. We have a month and an area. So if I just use index, say I wanted to pick out this value here. So that's on row 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's in column 1, 2, 3. So I could enter the formula equals index, say where my block of data is, B3 to E7, press F4 immediately to make both parts of my range absolute, and then I could say that I want row number 4, column number 3, and if I remembered that rightly, that should give me the cell that I had highlighted, 4th row down, 3rd column across. So that's the index part. Let's look at match. So let's just type in, say, Asia here, and we'll use match. So match is very similar to VLOOKUP in many respects. So it starts off in the same way. We have a value, and then we compare that to a range of cells. The difference with match is rather than being a two-dimensional range of cells, it's a one-dimensional range of cells, so it's just a list. So in this case, our list of countries, we need to include the corner cell for reasons that will become obvious shortly. So again, we just want our B3 to be 7 in this case. And just like VLOOKUP, we can do an exact match or a largest item less than, but do note that you can also do a smallest item greater than, which we'll have a look at in a minute. So one of the things you can do with match that you can't do with VLOOKUP is work with data sorted in descending order rather than the ascending order we've been looking at so far. So in this case, nice and easy, we want an exact match anyway, so we use an exact match, and that should find that Asia is the 1, 2, 3, third item in the list. We could do the same with, say, January equals match, look up our value, look it up in our list of cells, again including corner, make that absolute, match type 0 to exact, and that should tell us that January is the 2nd column. And then we could change index so that instead of having numbers in it, we look for the correct row and the correct column. So that should be Asia January, and if we were to change it to, say, February, then the result of match would change, and that would mean that our match and index formula would return Asia February. Of course, we can go further, and as we've done here, we can build the match into the index. So we can just have one formula that combines index and then the match for the row, the match for the column, to give us the value at the intersection between a column and a row. So things that match and index can do that VLOOKUP can't. It can work with items sorted in descending as well as ascending order. It can find the value at an intersection by column and row rather than just by a column index or a row index. And also one of the things that VLOOKUP has to do is to work from left to right. Match and index don't care. You could look in column, the March column, and find the country just by the ranges you select. So it can also work from right to left as well as left to right. Here's an example of match and index and the smallest item greater than. So what we've got here is we've got a list of webinars chosen purely at random, and the idea is that we want to know, up here we want to know what the current or the next event is. So what you have to do is compare the current time, list, and then choose the next item upwards in our list. So in this case it's 4:56 here, and the item in the list, next item that matches, is the same day at 18:30, and as you can see, our list is sorted in this case in descending rather than ascending order. And if we look at our match function, you'll see it uses -1, and if we just see what that represents, we'll see that represents the greater than match rather than the less than match that we've been discussing with VLOOKUP. And here we have hopefully a relatively practical example where we've extended our VAT example that we looked at just now to cope with invoices that have been raised at different rates of VAT. So we have a table of rates with different rates for different types of VAT, and what our match and index function does is to look at our entire table here, compare the date using an approximate match with our date column, and compares the type using an exact match with our type headers, so that we get the correct VAT rate based on the date of the invoice, date the VAT rate became active, and also the type of VAT that the invoice was analysed to. So that's the sort of typical use of lookups. Let's just go now and have a look at avoiding lookups altogether. We'll look at this file here. Let's just open it up. Takes a second or two. Let's get in there. It's quite a big file for reasons we'll see. So here's our other sheet. I'm just going to close the original one just to hopefully speed things up a bit. So just close the original workbook. Go back to our workbook here. So this is our example from earlier where we were trying to categorize all of our individual amounts. So this is like a trial balance. Got all our nominal codes, got our values. We want to categorize our codes in order to be able to produce our summary, just like we did before. And we're going to try and do it without using any function, but what we're going to do is use a data tool. Now in 2016, we're going to use the get and transform group of the data ribbon. In 2010, Excel 2010, Excel 2013, did I just say 2013? This is 2016. So get and transform in 2016. In 2010 and 2013, there is a separate add-on called Power Query that carries out these functions. Power Query, I think, is now available to all editions of those two versions of Excel. It was originally restricted to certain editions, the Professional Plus edition, but I think it is now more open. So what I'm going to do first of all is to load the structure here. So I've called this table TB structure. I'm going to load the structure into Power Query. So I'm going to choose from table. That opens up the query editor. And there's my table. Now, perhaps slightly strangely, I'm not going to do anything to it. I'm just going to choose to close and load. And I don't want to put it anywhere, I just want to create the connection. So I just say create connection and load that up, and that just means that there is now a query that remembers that data. Now I'm going to go to my other table. Because it's a table, I just have to click anywhere in my table and it recognizes the full area of the table. I'm going to do exactly the same thing from table. So it's going to open my table in the query editor once more. And this time I'm going to use the option within the home ribbon of Get and Transform or Power Query to merge my two queries together. So I'm going to try and repeat the way that VLOOKUP works. So I'm going to choose my TB structure query that I just created, and I want to look up my code values in my code column. So I choose the code column in both tables, and it says it's match 5 out of the first 40 rows. If you remember, there were 5, well, you don't have to remember, you could look down there really. There are 5 items in our structure table, so it's only match 5 of them. So we click on OK, and we can see here we've got our original table, our trial balance, and then we've got this new column that just says table. That column represents the whole of the structure table. And we can click on the little icon in the column and say that we want to expand it to show certain information. We just want to show the category. So if we just turn on the category, we won't use the original column name as a prefix. When we do that, we should find that it does pretty much exactly what an exact VLOOKUP would do. It matches where there's an exact match, gives you an error message where there isn't. Now we want to make sure that our code column is sorted in ascending order, exactly as we had to with VLOOKUP. We can then go to our category column and we can choose transform fill down, and that will then fill the nulls with the first actual value above. So that creates exactly the same structure of table that we created using our VLOOKUP function. We can then use our close and load to stick that maybe on a new sheet, or perhaps just to demonstrate this, we'll stick it on the same sheet. Now the first time you do it, it does take a little while to actually go through and do it, so there'll be a little pause while it does it. I'll just have a quick glance at your questions while it's doing that, so I'm prepared. Okay, I'll return to those in a minute. And now we can see that it's created our table in exactly the same way that the VLOOKUP function does. Let's just show one of the issues with, or the differences with using this type of technique, database type of technique rather than a function type of technique. If we were to make a change, so what I'm going to do here is to insert some rows in my table, and I'm going to say that 0 to 19 is sales, but 20 up to 99 is actually, let's say, UK sales. So this should affect all of the items from 20 to 60 in this case. Now you'll see that absolutely nothing has changed. That's because, unlike a function or a formula in Excel, which recalculates automatically when anything that affects it is changed, by default, where you have a query based on tables within Excel, you have to refresh the query. You can actually set it up to refresh automatically, but it does it by a period of time, not when something's changed. So it's a different way of working. But if I were then to just right-click in my table and refresh, you'll see that pretty much instantly that change follows through into my table. So we've now done the same as VLOOKUP did, but without using a single function, just by using the Power Query thing. Now you might wonder why that's important, why that's useful. Sometimes it's just a bit less error prone because you haven't got potentially thousands of formulae, every one of which needs checking, every one of which could be wrong. The other thing to think about is perhaps also the speed. So here we've got our example from earlier where we've got our IDs and our values. But what I've done is I've changed my ID column, which had all the formulae, to rather than just have 1,000 entries, to have over 1 million entries. Now, if you remember when we did this using VLOOKUP, the exact form of VLOOKUP, it took, I reckoned, about 15 seconds. And I have done some experiments, and it's a pretty linear relationship. So if you double the number of rows to 2,000, it takes about 30 seconds. If you double that to 4,000, it takes about 1 minute. You double that to 8,000, it takes about 2 minutes. So if you want to do it for 1 million, I worked it out as something along the lines of 1 million, I think that's the right number of zeros, divided by 1,000 times 15, and then to convert it to hours, we'll divide it by 60 for minutes, divide it by another 60 for hours, to find out how long VLOOKUP would take to perform this calculation. And I make it, unless I've got the zeros wrong, just over 4 hours. So we're going to start now, because otherwise it will be dark by the time we finish. So here we've used that exact same use of get and transform or power query that we saw just now, but we've used it so that we've got 1 million rows rather than 1,000 rows. And I'm going to do exactly what I did before, which is just to change one of the values. Nothing happens because I haven't refreshed, and then we're going to compare this time with the 4 and a bit hours. So I make it a bit after 5 o'clock, so if we watch our clocks carefully and see how long it takes, we'll refresh, and you can see here it's running the query. My clock says 17:09. So as long as it gets there before 9:21 this evening, then it's faster. So again, there's a bit of a pause for a couple of hours here, so I'll have a quick look at the questions again. You can just see down here, it's now preparing the worksheet. And it should have finished in about a minute. So Power Query does the exact match in about a minute, maybe 2, compared with a function which would have taken over 4 hours. So that's a quick look through VLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, match and index, and using database tools rather than functions. We've got a few minutes for your questions, so let me just have a look at them and pick out the easy ones. So well, let's do one that's really easy and a very good question. What was the hotkey that enabled me to create the range automatically? So I will just open my previous example in case we need it. So let's just open the previous one, and we'll look at creating a range. So it'll just take a while to load up, so we'll do that one. Somebody's asked if the exact match would recalculate any faster if the column was sorted. No, I don't think it would. I don't know that for sure, so you might like to try it, but I don't think it would. It's the fact that the approximate match and the exact match work in completely different ways. I believe the way in the background that the exact match works is that it sort of takes the value and visits every single one until it finds the right one. So what would make a difference was whether you were looking for an item early in the list or later in the list. So let's just do that. I'll use some ifs, whatever. When you do a range, if you press the F4 key, so that's the function keys at the top of the keyboard, F4, if you do it immediately after the range, it makes the whole range absolute. If you were to, let's just do it again, if you were to do the range, then remember you should have done F4 and go back to exactly the same place and press F4, it only does the one it's adjacent to. You have to select the other one to do the other one. And F4 cycles through all the options, so it cycles through the 4 absolute and relative options, so it's quick way rather than typing in the dollars. Somebody says they've used VLOOKUP with a formula in the third argument to change the column to retrieve the number. Is this a bad thing to do? I can't think that it is. Obviously every formula that you use, there is a risk, but as long as you've ensured that it always gives you the right answer, I think that's a valid way to proceed. I will give a health warning to all of these answers. I don't have a long time to think about them or try them out, so do experiment before relying on anything I say. Right. I think a lot of the other questions I've probably dealt with. Oh, there's a few more. There's a few admin things like can you have access to the workbooks that I'll I think that can be done, but I'll leave Jonathan to sort that out for you. Somebody would like me just to do the Power Query thing again. A lot of people have mentioned pivot tables. In terms of the end result, there are good reasons why a pivot table would do it. So in terms of just getting that summary, so if we just go back to our VLOOKUP Approximate, getting the summary here, we could use a pivot table, but if our original data didn't have the category field, we've still got to have some method of knowing what categories our codes need to be divided into. And there are some occasions when pivot tables aren't ideal. The end result of a pivot table is pretty much defined unless you use get pivot data or cube functions, things like that. It's quite difficult to create a structured management report with subtotals and all that sort of stuff out of a pivot table. So there are occasions when a combination of VLOOKUP and some ifs, as we saw there, might be better. Let me just very quickly just redo that Power Query thing. So what I did was I clicked in my table. I'd already set this up as a table. The table had a name. I clicked anywhere in the table, it recognizes it as a table. I went to data from table, or if I was using an earlier version, I could have gone to the Power Query add-in. From table loads that table into the query editor, and I only want that to be a query that I can use in another query, so I don't want to load it to any sort of external thing, I just want it to be available. So I go to close and load to, and just choose to only create the connection, so it's available as a query but doesn't clutter up my workbook. Then I go to my trial balance, again a table, so again I just click in it, again just click from table, that loads that up as a second query. And then what I want to do is to merge my two queries, so this table here can look up the code value in my structure, my TB structure query. So I go to merge queries. That shows me the current query that I'm working on and gives me the chance to choose another query. I'll choose my structure query, and so there I've got my different tables with my different fields. I want to match the code columns, so I click on code in my top table, code in my bottom table, click on OK. The new column appears. I choose to just bring in the category. I get my value. You can see we've got UK sales now. I get my value and lots of nulls where there's no match. I want to make sure my code is sorted in ascending order, because I then want to use the transform fill option to fill down to replace my nulls with the appropriate category. Done that, I can use close and load 2 to put the resulting table with all 3 columns wherever I want. So I just chose a cell on my current worksheet and just stuck it on my worksheet. And the important thing to remember is, unless you set it up to automatically refresh every so many minutes, you need to refresh it when the data changes. I think that probably brings us pretty much to the end. Just before we finish, I would like to offer you a piece of advice born out of painful personal experience, and that is never walk through a flock of pigeons assuming that none of them are going to crash into the side of your face. Thank you very much indeed for participating in the webinar. I hope it's been useful. You will, I believe, have access to the webinar recording at some point in the future. Thank you very much, and I hope well, I won't see you, but I hope I will sense your presence at a future webinar, maybe in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you very much.